Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Good evening, Ambassador. Thank you for joining us this evening on the 16th of September 2022. Mahsa Jina Amini died or was killed after the police had arrested her. And this sparked, as you probably all know, a wave of protests in Iran, women, life and freedom. And if we look around the world, internationally or domestically, we could say that women, life, freedom could be a slogan actually for all of the countries that seek equality, human rights, the right to live and not to die of hunger or destruction, and the right and the possibility to seek freedom. So 3 years after this tragedy, we also understand that the country of Iran, not only in the 20th century, has seen many, many protests, many demonstrations, many people, women and men, resisting authoritarianism, dictatorship, fundamentalism. So not only in Iran, but we see also in other countries, not only in that region, but close, so in Turkey, so Lebanon, Serbia, Georgia. We see hundreds and thousands of people flocking to the streets, protesting, and still regime change, one of the topics of this evening, has not come yet, and is in many ways, unfortunately, unlikely maybe to come, which also makes people quite desperate, people in these countries, in that region. For this evening, when we look inside Iran, regime resilience and the struggle for change, I think and I hope this issue also will come up, and I'm very, very happy and honored also by the guests we have here, because all three of them, of course, they can speak about many, many other issues as well, but I think they can particularly well and informed speak about Iran. So this is Solmaz Khorsand. Thank you very much, an independent journalist and fellow at the Institute, at the EVM Institute for the for a fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, the EVM. And she is with us as a moderator this evening, the first time, at least in my period, of the Bruno Kreisky Forum. So thank you very much for being here. And our two guests from abroad. Oh, no, it's okay. All good, all good. Azadeh Kian, a political scientist, and both guests will be introduced to you in greater detail by Solmaz. So welcome, Azadeh Kian. Thank you for coming. And Ali Fathollah-Nejad, thank you, political scientist coming from Germany, joining us. Thank you. I wish you, or I'm sure you will have an interesting encounter with both of our guests, and I wish you an interesting discussion afterwards. So again, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabine, for your introduction, and good evening from my side. I'm very honored to moderate today's panel with this very renowned experts. Welcome, Khosh Omadid. And before we start, I introduce the two of you. Azadeh Kian, she's a distinguished professor of sociology, former director of the Social Sciences Department and the Center for Gender and Feminist Studies at the University Paris Cité. She has written numerous books, I think about 7, and her most recent one is Rethinking Gender, Ethnicity and Religion in Iran, an intersectional approach to national identity. She's a regular commentator in international media. Ali Fathollah-Nejad, many of you might know him from the German media. He's a political scientist, director of the Center for Middle East and Global Order, and he most recently published his book, Iran, How the West Betrayed Its Values and Interests. You can purchase it outside, and I'm sure Ali is willing to sign it as well. If we talk about Iran, there are, I think, many issues that we could talk about. It's the regime, the democracy movement, the women's movement, human rights, the nuclear issue, the geopolitical situation. But let me start a little bit selfish, because I would like to start with something that is on my mind since June, and this is the war between Iran and Israel and the following fragile ceasefire. If you have followed the news, most of you know that all experts basically are foreseeing the next round of war, and everyone is saying it will be more violent, more brutal, more lethal than the first round. And I would like to ask both of you this question: how this war had impacted the regime itself and also the democracy movement in Iran. Let's start with you, Azadeh.
Thank you very much. First, I'm very thrilled to be here this evening, and thank you for the invitation. Basically, when we talk about war between Israel and Iran, it was not a war between Iran and Israel. Israelis bombed Iran while Iranians were negotiating with the Americans around nuclear issue. And a sixth round of negotiations were going to be held on a Sunday, but Israelis bombed Iran on a Friday. According to the Iranian foreign minister, the negotiations were very fruitful with the Americans. According to Mr. Blinken, who is the former Secretary of State, Iranians had even accepted to enrich uranium only for 1%. To say that the negotiations were going on well, and this is where Netanyahu decided to bomb Iran. And I say bomb Iran because infrastructures do not belong to the Islamic regime. We all despise this regime. We want this regime to be changed, but what happened was that over 1,700 Iranians were killed. Over 1,000 of them are civilians. And the infrastructures also were destroyed. So this is one thing. Another thing that's happened was that the Iranian civil society that was gaining importance following the Mahsa Jina Amini movement, and despite the repressions, is now, I'm talking about the organized civil society, that is student movement, women's movement, and so on and so forth, has been weakened because of these attacks and because of this war, because the Iranian regime is now, first of all, arresting every opponent and labeling them Israeli spy. A person was just executed yesterday, labeled an Israeli spy, and other people have been executed. So repression, this is a corrupt and, of course, repressive regime. But the war, one of the important impacts of the war was that this regime has become even more repressive and more executions since June 12th. This is one thing. The other thing is that contrary to what Netanyahu and eventually Trump and some opponents believed, Iranians did not welcome the war. Quite the contrary. Why? Because contrary to what many people think, Iran is I should say Iran is a reality, a historical reality. And people who live in Iran together have been living together for many, many, many centuries. And this is one thing that differentiates Iran from, for instance, Iraq or some other countries that have been created following the First World War. Iran has been there, and Iranians, even Kurds, even Baluch people, even Turkmens are the last one who came to Iran, and their settlement goes back to 1,200 years ago. And I've been working on these minorities, which I talk about in my recent book. And so what I want to say is that contrary to what some people thought, Iranians did not welcome the war, quite the contrary. The regime had been weakened because of social movements, but it has been strengthened. I mean, its repression has been strengthened because of the war.
I would like to go there to Ali. Like, if you think of the impact of the war, can you say like which camps within the regime have been strengthened after the war and which have been weakened?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's very good to be here. Thank you to the Kreisky Forum for the kind invitation. Good to see you, Solmaz. Good to see you again, Azadeh, of course. What basically happened at the outset of the war, that the Israelis they decapitated the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, so the top generals of the Islamic Republic, and they were able to do so based on a huge intelligence network that they have developed inside Iran. So many of those attacks, happened from inside Iran. So it was a kind of widespread intelligence-based kind of blitzkrieg that the Israelis embarked upon, taking out, as I said, a dozen of top generals of the IRGC, many of the advisors of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. So basically, he more or less lost his think tank. And what also was very important is that Khamenei took refuge in a bunker. So, and then there was a degradation of his conditions, and he also cut communications with the political and military establishment. And in my view, the 12-day war is the start of post-Khamenei Iran. Ever since, we are, contemplations about post-Khamenei Iran are widely shared, even by regime circles, which is a new thing. I mean, the last interview was with the son of one of the top generals in Iran, who talked about that. So this is the start of post-Khamenei Iran. Now, is there a power shift or a power vacuum? So because in my estimation, of course, the IRGC has been militarily quite hit hard. But in terms of decision making, I think there is also some aspect of a power vacuum. Because it's not because, Khamenei was the center of gravity within the system in terms of decision making, and this role is, he doesn't assume this role anymore. So it's, I think, the strategic perplexity that the Islamic Republic was finding itself after the unraveling of the Iran so-called axis of resistance, so this kind of militia network in the Middle East over the course of last year, also again at the hands of Israel, led to a strategic perplexity because the Iranians didn't have those kinds of proxies with which they could project power and deter Israel. Now there is another layer to the strategic perplexity. It's, the Israelis controlled all of Tehran airspace, so the entire air defense was knocked out. This was the third direct military confrontation between the two that we've seen. The first two happened in April and October of last year, in the post-October 7th, 2023 kind of. The ramifications in terms of the power structure, in my view, are still in flux. But what we can say for sure, I think, it's the advent of post-Khamenei Iran.
But the regime lost its face even among its strongest supporters, right? Because they saw like this wannabe hegemon that always talk about the axis of resistance. It doesn't have anymore this leverage on these proxies on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's no longer, it couldn't defend its own country. It was defenseless.
True, it was defenseless, but the regime propaganda actually says that Israel was, they imposed peace upon Israel because of Iranian missiles being fired onto Israel, which this time around, in comparison to last year, were hitting much more civilian areas also in Israel. So the cost for the Israeli sides was also quite elevated, more elevated. But the propaganda of Tehran is basically that, no, it's our missiles that actually imposed peace upon the other side. And plus the missiles, of course, that they fired at the end of the war onto Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the headquarters of CENTCOM.
I would like to go to the question of the ethnicities and the minorities in the country, because I remember we talked 3 years ago after the death of Mahsa Jina Amini about the possibility of a civil war in Iran. And I remember always that this is a typical regime propaganda to say like Iran is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state, and we have all these different groups, and if the regime collapses, like we will have a second Afghanistan, a second Syria, a second Iraq. And after this 12 days, I wasn't sure if it's only propaganda or if there is a grain of truth in it.
Well, I don't think so. As you mentioned, Iran, of course, is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, but Iranians who live there, being Kurds, Baluchis, Turks, Arabs, and so on, I'm not talking about some militant, some opponent groups within these minorities. I'm talking about ordinary people. They do not want to be to be independent from Iran. They consider themselves as Iranians, and what they have always wanted is, why are we marginalized by the regime? Why are we poor? Why are our regions underdeveloped? But their demands have not been, even Kurds, who are the most politically minded and politically active minorities, Kurds are not actually demanding to be autonomous. All they want is to be autonomous, that is to be independent from Iran. All they want is regional autonomy. And also, when I was working with Baluchis or with Turkmens, as I mentioned earlier, they all consider themselves as Iranians. Right, but nonetheless, they want, for instance, their culture, their language to be spoken at in schools, universities. They want to be considered as citizens of Iran and not as minorities. So if, one day, if we have a democratic Iran, of course, these people are parts and parcels of Iran, as I mentioned earlier. And so I do not see any risk of Afghanization or Iraqization of Iran, as I mentioned, because when I look at Iraq, with all my due respects, Iraq was used to be three former provinces of the Ottoman Empire. The northern parts with the Kurds, center parts with the Sunnis, and southern parts with the Shiites, and then they put them together and they made Iraq. So no real sentiments of belonging. Whereas Iranians I'm talking about, despite being marginalized and impoverished and so on, but they have always been parts of Iran. So I do not personally see any risk of a civil war. And we know that a lot of enemies of Iran or this regime, actually, I won't name them, but have been trying to fund different groups in Balochistan, within the Kurdish militant movements, in Khuzestan, and so on and so forth. But it just didn't work. And what happened when Israelis attacked Iran? What happened? Basically, every Iranian just remained Iranian. And some Tehranis, of course, those who could, as we know, left Tehran because they did not want to be bombed, but they did not take the streets to topple the regime, because this is not the way you topple a regime. A regime will be toppled, and it will certainly be ongoing. As Ali mentioned, we are in post-Khamenei era, and the regime has been really weakened, not because of the Israeli attacks, but because of all these social movements, all these oppositions. 80% of the Iranian society is against this regime. So today they can, stay in power thanks to repression, to their military and militarization, and also to this war, ongoing war tensions that they have been creating as well. But I don't see anyways a risk of a civil war.
Do you see any groups within the country that would be interested in a dissection of Iran?
Actually, I totally agree with Azadeh Kian. The only difference is that Azadeh Kian did a lot of research, which I didn't do. But I'm.
So you better agree with me.
Exactly. No. Actually, I mean, we don't have to forget that during the Women Life Freedom Uprising in September in 2022, there were a lot of solidarity messages between different ethnicities, between people in Azerbaijan, where I was born, in Tabriz, and between people in Iranian Kurdistan, in Baluchistan. So there were a lot of messages in the respective mother tongues as well, other than Persian, for to say that we are fighting for the same thing. We are fighting for a free Iran, basically, of which we're all. And I think there is a lot of misconceptions in Western capitals about this issue. This is one of the main arguments put forward against change in Iran, because a lot of people, in the Western capitals do argue, in fact, that it's going to lead to precisely what Azadeh explained, to this kind of Iraqization, Syrianization, or Balkanization, whatever. But I think this is not, the history of Iran is a different one.
Because they still think in this, as you mentioned in your book, in this authoritarian stability of Iran, right? This is one of the main paradigms of Western foreign policy vis-à-vis the Middle East for decades, not only pertaining to Iran, but I've been arguing that it doesn't only apply to the Arab world, this idea of authoritarian stability, so the idea that dictatorships and authoritarian regimes are better equipped to provide stability than something that we don't know about. And I think the same thinking also applies to the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So this has been the underpinning of our Western, our European approach and policy vis-à-vis Iran for many years, to assume that, although, the regime might be bad, but it's somehow stable. And we in Europe or the West have to work with regimes that are stable. It's good for us. So this was the assumption. I would like to, because you both mentioned Women Life Freedom movement, and you, Azadeh, you worked extensively of the role of women in Iran's resistance. Could you give a very brief overview for people who don't know the role of Iranian women in resistance in Iran? Because I think, no Iranian was really surprised that the women are at the forefront of the Women Life Freedom protest movement, because we all knew they're the Shirzan, and yes.
Yes. Actually, yes, Iranian women have participated in various social movements ever since the 19th century. The first time they were in a social movement was in 1891, the tobacco protest movement. And then later on, 1906, the constitutional movement, and several of them, at least tens of them, were killed also because they took arms, including and especially in Tabriz, where you come from, Ali, and also elsewhere in Iran, to resist both absolutism and also foreign encroachment in Iran. And then they, right from 1905, they created their secret associations and they demanded their rights, including political rights, and they fought for it. Nonetheless, they were not given, of course, political rights up until 1963. But they always continued to resist, including during the nationalization of oil under Mossadegh, and this was a very important period because a lot of women, those who worked as workers, as employees, cadres, and so on and so forth, or as feminists, also did take part in the nationalization of oil movement under Mossadegh. Now, this was one important part of our history where Iranians had a democratic government, a democratic parliament, and it was toppled by who? By a coup d'etat. Led by who? By CIA. And this was the first CIA coup in the world. So don't say Iranians don't, or Middle Easterners don't, are not democratic and they need authoritarian regimes. No, they are democratic like everyone else and can have and deserve democracy. Now, women continued more or less their participation in those movements, and especially after the Islamic regime. I do remember that on March 8, 2 months, that's 1 month, sorry, after the triumph of the victory of the revolution, when women, including myself, who realized that they are going to impose regressions on us, and they are going to, for instance, regressions when it comes to legislation, and also that the veil was going to become compulsory. We took the streets. I was young, but we took the streets to protest. And and these protests continued. So women rights freedom movement, Zan Zendegi Azadi movement was not just something that happened in 222. We have at least from 1906 our grandmothers who have been involved in these type of movements and to earn their rights. But for the first time, and this is what is very important, is that women were at the forefront of this movement. And this was not just a women's movement or a feminist movement. A lot of men, young men, who are being executed in prison today and started to be executed also from 222, did take part in the movement. And there is a crucial solidarity between now men and women in Iran. Of course, not all men, but some of them. Mm-hmm. And so this is also one of the most important acquisitions or things that Iranians actually, all in all, acquired thanks to this social movement again. But it was not just around women's rights, as you know. It was about secularization, citizenship rights, social justice, and so on and so forth. So equality between ethnicities, religions, genders, sexualities, and so on and so forth. And so this make this movement a very peculiar movement of contemporary Iran, and it is still alive, as we can see. And they have acquired some of their demands because women in Iran have occupied the public space and they are staying there. And this is very, very, very important, including in Baluchistan, actually.
Yeah, it's not only in the urban areas.
It's not just in Tehran or Isfahan or Shiraz. It's also in these more conservative parts of Iran.
I would like to ask you, both of you, if you share my sentiment when it comes to the Western view on Iranian women, like having this kind of fetishization of the Iranian woman, because I was wondering why the West is so interested in this Iranian feminist movement and not, for example, for the Sudanese women that also like fought very hard in 2019, and we all remember this woman, this student who was in the white veil, but no one was talking, or not as extensively as about Iranians. Why do you share this sentiment? And
I don't know. I would love to hear Azadeh's thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, my own experience with the French political parties, I made a lot of course, I was invited everywhere, the parliament, European Parliament, and also politicians in France and so on. What I saw, now I'm not talking about the European Parliament, but I'm talking about all these political parties, they really instrumentalized women's movement in Iran because, and I always kept saying, this is not a movement against the veil, this is a movement against compulsory veiling. But then they used it in the French media, for instance, a lot against Muslim women in France who, are veiled. So this was an instrumentalization of the movement, and this is why they love Iranian women. Of course, because Iranian women are secular. I'm talking about the movement, right? And Iranian feminists, because we're secular, we're not veiled, we're against Islamism, we're against political Islam, we share a lot of Western, quote-unquote, Western values, and this is why they like us. But at the same time, Sarah Faris, whom you might know, has a term for this, and it's called femo-nationalism. That is to say that as a nationalist, Western nationalist, a feminist, you consider yourself to be superior to others, and you want to sort of say who is with us and who is against us. And this is where Iranian women are being used and instrumentalized to kind of enforce a femo-nationalism. And some of them actually love it and play the role they are given. I'm talking about many, of course, of my French Iranian feminists who are live in Europe or elsewhere. But my understanding of what's going on in Iran is that these people again are not against Islam in itself. They are not against the veil itself. What they are demanding is liberty, freedom, freedom, freedom. I want not to put the veil. I want to put whatever I want to. I want to behave the way I want to. I want to live. I want to decide for my own life. I don't need the state, Islamic or secular state, to tell me how to behave as a woman. My body belongs to me. Okay? So these are all what came out of this movement.
Do you want to add something to that, or should I?
No, I mean, the reality on the ground is, which I also, lay out in detail in my book, is their multifaceted, kind of discrimination against Iranian women. So there is a material reality of this discrimination. There's this kind of Western perception that Azadeh, rightly criticized. On the other hand, there are material realities, a multifaceted kind of discrimination, socioeconomic one, the unemployment rate of women, both on average and also within the younger generation, is double the rate of that of men. The work participation is 1/5 of that of men. There is a gender apartheid that was established right after the revolution, with the state's willingness to control the bodies and lifestyle of women. There is also the sociocultural kind of discrimination, also with the hijab. There's a political discrimination. You don't find a lot of women in the higher echelons of the political system in Iran, which is a highly patriarchal one. So there are a lot of sources of discrimination that pertain to the specific case of Iranian women.
Yeah, I mean, the entire constitution, civil code, penal laws, they are all discriminatory laws against women, but also religious minorities. We should not forget that. And for this very, very reason, the women rights movement, Zan Zendegi Azadi, sorry, movement, because I say it always in French, so did bring all these demands together, that was against all these discriminations that not only women but also ethnic and religious minorities are confronting.
Ali, you coined this term of the revolutionary process, and to see this kind of protest movements in a continuity. Can you maybe, how much did the West obstructed this revolutionary process in Iran throughout the years?
Actually, I first proposed the term in 2018. I talked about the long-term revolutionary process. It's a term, it's a concept that I borrowed from my PhD supervisor, who is Gilbert Ashkar, who is a French-Lebanese sociologist who conceptualized the Arab Spring as a long-term revolutionary process in the Arab world. And when I was at SOAS and doing my PhD, I realized there are a lot of parallels between the Arab world and the Arab Spring countries and Iran. Whereas the conventional wisdom was that there is some kind of Iranian exceptionalism. Yeah. Iran is different. People don't want radical change because they have this trauma with the 1979 revolution. So this is what they always want. They want to limit themselves onto reforming the system. Also looking at the socioeconomic indicators, you see a lot of parallels between the Arab Spring countries in the Arab world and the case of Iran when it comes to the position of, to the conditions of women, but also to the youth. So those two, marginalized social groups, they suffer from the same kind of malaise in both cases. And for me, the turning point to argue that what we're now seeing as the start of a long-term revolutionary process was after the so-called day protest at the turn of the year 2017-18, that was triggered by higher social costs, but then got immediately politicized, spread to all over the country and in 100 cities and so forth. And this time around, it was driven by the lower classes. And during the 2009 Green Movement, it was predominantly the urban middle class, although there were also more radical elements, but still, trying to reform the system, to bring about change with reforming the system. And the continuation of the day protests was in November 2019, when there were again a nationwide uprising, again triggered by the social question. This time around, a tripling of the fuel prices overnight, that led again to a nationwide protest in over 100 cities of Iran. This time around, driven by a combination of the lower classes and what we call the middle class poor, so which is a sociological, it's basically a class, basically, that has middle class qualifications, and therefore also aspirations when it comes to social mobility, but who end up socioeconomically deprived or poor because of the political economy of the country. So in other words, the same social base that was driving the Arab Spring. So Bouazizi was also, from the middle class poor, basically, who set himself on, ablaze in Tunisia, kicking off the Arab Spring at the end of 2010. So you have, all those people in Iran who are university graduates, but who are unemployed, right? Mm-hmm. And who, because of the ideological grounding of the political economy between insiders and outsiders, between Khodi and Ghair Khodi, they don't have those chances of social mobility, because a lot of those jobs are given away because of regime loyalty rather than qualification. So you have a lot of parallels, in my view, between the Iranian and Arab cases when it comes to popular disenchantment with the economic and political system, that is controlled by the same elite that is monopolizing political and economic power. Mm-hmm. So, and then we had the erstwhile culmination of this process with the Women Life Freedom Uprising, who had a much larger social base, mm-hmm. and who this time around was not triggered by the social question, but by the by a socio-cultural one, by the hijab issue, but who saw a much wider societal participation. Mm-hmm. According to estimates, we had minimum 2 million people going to the streets in 22, whereas in 2019, according to the Ministry of the Interior, there were 200,000 people, mm-hmm. and whereas at the turn of the year 2017-18, there were 50,000.
Mm-hmm. I come back to my question because, do you think that the international community could have supported this revolutionary process?
Could have supported. In which way?
In a way that we see an end to the process and we see finally the revolution.
Well, I'm not sure, because why would they want to weaken a regime before knowing who is going to be the next alternative to the regime? This is a fact. And for the moment, as you said, Europeans, I'm talking about Europeans, I'm not talking Trump or Netanyahu, I'm talking about Europeans, they don't want to topple the regime, and they say it always. Why? Because for the moment, they have not found the next regime who is going to, replace this one. And unless this is the case, they don't want to topple the regime. They want to weaken the regime in order to be able to control the regime. And this is what is going on today. I mean, when President Macron, my president, says no uranium enrichment, zero uranium enrichment, no missiles, no this, no that, it means that they are trying to deprive the country from whatever is not the country and also the regime, of course. So this will most probably lead to the weakening of the regime and also the country. But I do believe that what is very important for the regime is to remain in power. And to remain in power, they are ready to make different concessions, for instance, yes, as I mentioned earlier, not zero uranium enrichment, but probably just 1% to say, well, we still have the right, but we don't do it, or we keep our missiles to defend our country and so on and so forth. But the whole thing is to remain in power. So they don't want to. What, nonetheless, they could have done to support the Iranian civil society is to stop imposing general sanctions. General sanctions have not been to the detriment of the regime. The regime has continued its nuclear program, has continued its ballistic missile program, has continued to fund all these proxy groups in the region. But when I see how Iranians today have problems really to meet to make the ends meet, and for instance, how they have difficulties finding medications. There are a lot of people who are dying in Iran due to lack of medication and so on and so forth. These are all the implications and impacts of the sanctions that are imposed on civil society. They are not imposed on the regime. Why is it that ordinary Iranians cannot obtain a visa, but the sons and daughters of those who are in power in Iran do have American and European passports or a residence card, and they have their bank accounts here. Sorry to say so, but no, Europe, I'm not talking about the States, but Europe has not done anything whatsoever to really support the Iranian civil society.
You are also very, very critical of especially the West and the international community, and you say there is a gray zone between appeasement and warmongering. What would that be if it's not war?
Yeah. I think there is a large gray area between belligerence on one hand and appeasement. What I believe that the Europeans and also some of the American administrations have done over the past years is to engage in appeasement. This is what and when it comes to, look at the kind of reactions from Europe after the uprising in Iran, the Zandagi Azadi, the Women Life Freedom Uprising. The European Union imposed half a dozen of sanctions packages against basically second or third ranking regime officials. So what they have not targeted is the top regime figures. So there were the possibility to do targeted sanctions against top regime figures, but the Europeans didn't do that. Why didn't they chose not to do that? Because they were very much focused on what they have been focused over the years, which is on the nuclear issue, on the nuclear negotiations. They didn't want to discourage the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, from playing along this diplomatic game by, for instance, putting the IRGC on the EU terrorism listing, for instance, right? So the priority for Europe was always to find some kind of accommodation or arrangement with the Islamic Republic to avoid a nuclear-armed Iran by this kind of nuclear obsession. And this nuclear obsession has obfuscated a lot. It has obfuscated security relevant areas such as the missile program, such as Iran's support for regional allies and proxies. And it has also disregarded the interests of the Iranian civil society. So it has always been, trying to find an accommodation with this regime because this is what we know. They're bad, okay, but at least this is what we know, right?
But if they put them on the terror list, why would the regime collapse after that?
No, I didn't argue that this would lead to a sudden collapse. The thing is not that the Europeans or the Americans are going to do regime change in Iran. This is not going to be the case. We're not in the post 9/11 era where this kind of idea with boots on the ground could gain attraction. Also, it's not feasible, right? So everyone knows that it would be much more catastrophic than Afghanistan and Iraq, right? So the issue here is that whether the West is playing a constructive or not a constructive role vis-a-vis this revolutionary process. Is it going to accompany it in a positive way? If it chooses to do so, it has to apply economic and political pressure on the Islamic Republic. This is the way to do it, is through sanctions, although sanctions are a hugely complex issue.
Well, I should say intelligence sanctions, Ali.
Intelligence, yeah.
Intelligence sanctions, not sanctions that are imposed on the Iranian civil society nowadays.
Yeah. Plus, but there's also a process, what I call the externalization of costs from the authoritarian state onto the civilian population. So you have the state that is sanctioning Iran, and then you have the Iranian state that is reacting. Okay, and in most cases, it is, increasing the cost on, increasing the cost onto the civilian population. So there is a process of that is not, Iranian people cannot control it. So the Iranian state can, to some extent.
Just wanted to mention that the West is not the entire world. I mean, the international community is not limited to the West. And what you see is that owing to these pressures, quote unquote, on the Islamic regime, they have really now turned to Russia and to China, especially. And you have a lot of Iranian political scientists and those who advise the regime and so on, who are really saying that Iran should give more, even overwhelming, I don't know how to put it, but I mean, should turn completely towards the East and forget about the West. And this is what has been happening for the past some years. And I think that the participation of the Iranian president, Iranian authorities in BRICS and more recently in Shanghai, for instance, is clear in that matter. And so when you sanction the Iranian oil, again, they still sell their oil. China is buying their Iranian oil. And Iranian regime is continuing to work again on its nuclear program and missiles and paying its proxy groups. But they are no longer, really protecting or paying for health, for education, and so on and so forth. So it is, all in all, the Iranian society that is, again, the victim of this type of sanctions. And what they say is, what additional sanctions? I'm talking about the snapback now. What additional sanctions? What do you want to do? You have done whatever you could, and you're still there. Because now they have, and now they have also India. So things are happening. And also, I just want to add that when Israel attacked Qatar, what happened was that Saudi Arabia just signed a military agreement with Pakistan, who is a nuclear power, military nuclear power, and is a Muslim country. So things are changing. Ali, I don't know what you think, but in this region, things are changing. The West is no longer the only reigning power in the region. Saudi Arabia can no longer count on the American military for its protection. They're turning to Pakistan. Okay, Pakistan, that, by the way, has never signed the nuclear agreement either in the NPT, but c'est pas grave, it's okay because they already have the nuclear power, so, you know. So things are changing. And our paradigm should change as well, I think. When we think about Iran or other countries in the region, we're still focused on the West and what Western countries want or do, and so on and so forth. But how about Russia and China that are not, of course, bringing democracy to any of these countries, of course?
Before I open the floor for questions, I would like to ask one final question about the opposition movement in abroad and inside. Like it's something that is always ridiculized in international media, that why can't the...
Sorry, can I just, before...
Yeah.
Can I say just 2 sentences on
Sure.
what we just
Yeah,
discussed? Sure. I mean, I have a slightly, perhaps, different view on sanctions. I mean, I think sanctions do or can, or sanctions harm both the state and society. How do they affect the state? They could affect the revenue side of the state. Look at Iranian oil purchases that we mentioned, right? The Iranians have now established a global shadow fleet, and the earnings from the oil sales do not go into the national economy, right? So in many cases, they go to the RGC or the RGC Quds Force, which is the regional arm of the RGC. So there's this kind of architecture. There are, regime figures and oligarchs and Ali Shamkhani and so forth, right? So you have, so they are selling Iran's oil for their own vested interests, right? So from that perspective, if you sharpen, if you have tighter control over Iranian oil sales to China by the United States, who can do that, right? I mean, when Trump started with the maximum pressure sanctions on Iran, the Chinese in November of 2018, they stopped all Iranian oil, imports, and the Iranians did have less funds for their proxies, right? So there is a kind of dynamic here. And then there is also this process of externalizing the cost from the authoritarian state that I mentioned earlier onto the civilian population. When sanctions are, and we have a very famous Iranian economist who is in Vienna, who is also part of CIMEC, who can tell us much more than I can about this subject. But when sanctions are lifted to a certain extent, there are positive effects for the Iran society as well, when it comes to the inflation rate and when it comes to the weight of the currency. So it does have real life impacts, but it can also exert pressure in a targeted and intelligent and smart manner if it's designed as such onto the state.
Sorry, what is the reason for these sanctions against the regime was the nuclear issue, as you mentioned yourself, and missile program. It didn't work out. They continued throughout 2018, 19, 20, and so on and so forth. They continued working on their nuclear program and their ballistic missiles, and they continued helping their proxy groups. So it just didn't work out. If the reason for sanctions was targeting the nuclear program, it failed. But if the reason was to target the civil society and to weaken the civil society, it succeeded. This is what I'm saying. And I'm not an economist. I'm a sociologist.
Yet there is also a difference between massive and maximum sanctions. I mean, the JCPOA would not have been possible without European sanctions. I mean, why the Islamic Republic changed course was because the Europeans had joined the Obama sanctions back then against SWIFT, which is the banking and financial system, and the Europeans had imposed their own oil embargo on Iran. So this increased the pressure on the political establishment as a result, the political establishment had to change the cost-benefit analysis. So they, you know, basically Khamenei green-lighted secret talks between Iran and the United States back then in Oman, which were the precursor of the official kind of negotiations that we've seen in this country and another European country.
I still want to ask my opposition question, but I'm sure like there are so many other people who want to ask a question, so I would like to open the floor to the audience, and if there aren't any, I will continue.